welcome to my paper, The Lives and Concerns of Girls in Antiquity. I work on the Roman world, in particular in Egypt under Roman rule, but also under Ptolemaic rule, and looking for evidence of children's lives and their voices in particular is extremely difficult in antiquity, partly because of the nature of the source material we have, but partly also because even in a discipline like classics, which is as old as a couple of hundred years at least, there's been very little attention paid until the last 30, 40 years to children in their own right and their histories and certainly their voices. So what we have to do is try to extrapolate from some of the material we have using various different methods and approaches to try and gain a picture of what life was like for young people in the ancient world. What I want to present in this video is just some snippets of things from various projects that I've been involved in, where specifically there is evidence for girls. And you'll see that some of that evidence is quite sparse here and there and covers a whole time scale which is quite large, but hopefully we'll be able to at least ask some of the right questions and see where the material takes us. On the front of my slide here is a typical image of a young girl in classical Athens from her grave stele holding a bird. And in particular, this was a very well-known symbol of innocence, particularly for young girls. And I want to start with this because I want to look at the images that come down to us of ideal childhood, particularly for girls. And when we look at antiquity, here's a Roman example of the kinds of qualities and traits that should be present according to many of our elite male sources. Pliny, for example, the senator would say of a young girl, she combined the wisdom and age and dignity of womanhood with the sweetness and modesty and youth of innocence. She clung to her father's neck and embraced us, his friends, with modest affection. She loved her nurse, her attendants, her teachers, and each of the service given her. She applied herself intelligently to her books and was moderate and restrained in her play. She bore her last illness with patient resignation and indeed with courage, and obeyed her doctor's orders. Now, this is a very clear example of somebody remembering a young girl who died quite young in all the ways that elite society of ancient Rome would have expected. Children very much are to be seen and not heard, and particularly girls must combine the traits of chastity, modesty, but also the dignity of becoming an adult woman. And we see here's another example of one of those grave steles from the Hellenistic period, so the period after classical Athens, in the 3rd century BCE, roughly. We see the images of children, particularly on funerary art, become more and more sentimentalized in particular ways, more associated with innocence and sweetness, and the Romans very much pick up on that. And it's very much a way in for us to think about childhood and representation. These are, in this funerary context, this art is meant to represent not only the life of this child, but the hopes that their parents and families instilled in them for their futures, of their families. What I've been looking at is kind of the reverse of this, not so much this kind of symbolic childhood and this idea that a lot of scholarship of childhood studies would have as, that would know as symbolic childhood, but the actual experience of young people. And one way into that with antiquity is to look at dolls. And the reason that we can look at dolls as a really interesting aspect of history, as some of the other papers in this conference will give case studies of, is that not only do we get this idea of a symbolic representation of what childhood and girlhood ought to be, but of course children would play with these dolls, so we can try to ascertain some idea of how these things were played with. So for instance, if we think about the doll on the right here, it's a very interesting but well-known doll, a Roman Faustina doll, with the hairstyle modelled on an elite empress's hairstyle. And then you look at the body of the doll, emphasis is placed very much on the navel and the pubic areas and the breasts, all parts of the body meant to emphasise capacity for fertility, so the fecundity of adolescent and adult women. And this is something that's given to young girls to play with in order to kind of attempt to socialise them. It's the kind of Barbie doll of its time. And what we see here, though, is if you notice the arms and so on are posable, so they can be moved and played with in particular ways. Now, what's interesting when we look at Egypt from the Roman period is we get very sort of different types of dolls that are intended with a very different purpose. So young people perhaps would even have been involved in making their own dolls of this type, but this is a much more malleable and much more you're much more able to play with this doll and handle it and move it around and pose it as you like. So one thing that studies of girlhood in antiquity have began to look at a while ago in looking at dolls is this issue of to what extent were children and young girls in particular being socialised in particular social and gendered perspectives on their lives. Well, to some extent, they would have perhaps transgressed some of those things. We look at more examples, and I wanted to show you some images from a project I've recently been involved with my colleagues at Kent, Ellen Swift and Joe Stoner, which was an HRC-funded project to look at the artefacts of everyday life from Roman and late antique Egypt, from this museum in London, the Petition Museum of Egyptian Archaeology, UCL, where there are over 80,000 objects from Egypt relating to everyday life, many of them from the Roman and late antique and early Christian periods. And there are quite a few dolls. Part of my remit on that project was to look at children's cultures as evidenced by the artefacts. And one thing that's really great about some of these, as you'll see from the masterclass on Thursday of this conference, is that when you actually think about the objects in terms of how you can handle them and what you can do with objects and material culture, you manage to ascertain some of the experience of the young people who were playing with them or holding them or using them for whatever other purpose. So one great thing about this project was that I got to look at and handle these objects. Here's a figurine or a doll. There's a whole discussion to be had about that kind of labelling, which I'll talk about in a moment. We have these almost like that Faustina doll I just showed you, the typical Roman one that we see across the Roman Empire. This is one that's quite specific to Egypt, but again, you get this emphasis on the navel and hips and belly and all the areas where you expect an emphasis on fertility. So they're kind of similar, but they're also similar to early Egyptian examples in this way. And of course, with the face and the arms broken off, model that's made of wood. One other thing that we did find was evidence of what I think is children's experience, but also their involvement in the production of the culture they're consuming. So look at this from the Khartoum in Egypt, another figurine which is quite almost flat rather than a rounded doll, but we can see it's in two halves. You can see almost that look like thumbprints, indents to represent breasts, as well as in the ears to represent where earrings or other type of ornaments would be hung. And this is very typical of a lot of the figurines that I found that were just the heads of Athena, the goddess Athena, where we had these holes in the ears, and they were used for hanging these things in various places around the home. And here we've got what appears to me as one half, the right-hand side, is very neatly kind of outlined and produced, and the left-hand side is kind of a slightly off-balance and smaller and less competent version of what happens on the right-hand side of this doll. So Some might argue that this is evidence of a young person being involved in the production of this type of artifact. You may think that's a bit of a stretch, but I then came across this item, which is a face of a figurine, and it looks quite straightforward. If you look at it closely from start to the side on, in the top left image, you can see the remnants, a few lines in the clay. And when we got the microscope camera on that, you can see clearly a fingerprint or a thumbprint. And even my adult little finger, and I'm quite a small-handed person, was much larger than that print. So it's clearly an impression made by a child during the production of this object. So this could attest, we have to make a lot of conjectural leaps here, but we do see that children were certainly present in the production space for a lot of these objects. So when we're looking at toys and dolls and figurines, there's lots of examples and how we gender them and so on. And one thing that struck me when I'm looking at more modern examples, and this may have been referred to, this photo essay by some of the other panels on children's material culture, but I began to ask what exactly children's material culture is. And there's a great photo essay a few years ago by Gabriele Galimberti, who asked children across the world to exhibit their favourite toys. And of course, some of these are the most striking examples I saw, where we see very gendered and very socially and culturally specific objects, particularly in the boys' aeroplanes and almost adventurous and militaristic objects, and in the girls, more household, domestic, those kinds of things. The kind of toys that are used in attempts to socialise or to continue expected gendered and social norms, but also the idea that anything can be a toy in a child's hands. So what exactly are we looking for when we're looking for children's material culture? And one thing that we do have to think about is the nature of some of these objects that we're looking at, like these figurines and dolls. Some of them were not intended to be played with. They were just figurines that were meant for ornamental or votive or religious purposes around the home or religious spaces. Some of them were meant to be played with, and some of them were just objects that children pick up. And one of the most important books around this topic from the archaeologist Joanna Safar-Derevensky talks about children's material culture and how, as an archaeologist or a historian, it's incredibly difficult to label and categorize. So, for instance, if you're looking at a society, any period of history, any part of the world where, for example, you have child soldiers, if a child picks up a gun, that's obviously not a toy, but it's of course part of that child's material world, part of their material culture. And so these things are hidden from us. And what we have to do is to try and find where these children were in antiquity, what their space was, what they were looking at, what they were picking up, what they were involved in, and what that experiences, how they differed for girls and boys. Now, for antiquity, we're looking at a society that's highly gendered, but also it's highly socially stratified. And so I would argue that for the period I'm looking at in particular, although there were huge differences between the lives and experiences and the worlds of girls and boys, I think it's my strong sense that actually the greater differences were between different social groups. And I, of course, don't have time in this talk to go through them, but we can perhaps discuss in questions. But of course, in the ancient world, one of the biggest markers of social distinction and practical and everyday experience was the practice of slavery and enslavement. And so we've got evidence from Egypt in the Roman period of enslaved children. And I was talking about this on another conference on child slavery in the Roman world. And it struck me that there's quite a bit of evidence from Egypt of girls who were enslaved. Partly we see them referred to in in quite offhand ways. We find them in these documents, such as this one, a contract to a wet nurse to nurse a foundling. So foundlings who were picked up, abandoned infants who were then given to women who were paid and contracted to nurse them as wet nurses, who would then, that would be worth in monetary terms to whoever did that. That would then mean that young infant would become enslaved and under the ownership of that person. And so we get these detailed in these contracts, people being asked to, or entrusted and contracted to nurse young infants, and those infants would then be designated slave status. And speaking of enslaved children, another set of issues that we need to consider, and is something that, you know, I'm going to look in a lot more detail from around the Roman world, and particularly across Egypt, is the enforced movement of children. And this is applicable to girls in as much as it is to boys, perhaps even more so. We see this example, a document detailing the transaction of involving a young girl who'd been enslaved and then sold and moved at various ages, and not just short distances, you know, from Mauritania, modern day Algeria, all the way into Egypt, to the city of Oxyrhynchus, and being traded and sold numerous times. And of course, it's very difficult for us to understand the lives of these girls. We only see this snapshot of their lives, but of course, it's important for us to understand, or at least acknowledge, how traumatic an experience that might have been, or that certainly would have been, and what impact that has on the lives of girls and where they end up. If they end up in places like Oxyrhynchus, big Hellenized cities in Egypt, their life and their experience would have been very different from other parts of the Roman world, but still in this traumatized state of enslavement. So we see lots of evidence, and here's another example, which is from a document from Oxyrhynchus, which I'll just leave up there, and presumably you'll be able to pause. One of the benefits of having pre-recorded papers is you can pause the video and actually read the text, so that I don't have to read it out for you. And this is a petition, which is of course full of rhetoric. This is somebody who's writing the petition to the local strategos, the local official, high up official, talking about something that's happened, and that her young girl who is enslaved, she's referred to as of slave status, and was going around town on the way to a singing lesson and was struck down by some transportation, Polydeuces, who was driving a donkey. And this person is then trying to seek redress for the damage and injury caused to this young girl. Now, of course, there's many different ways to read this. The fact that it was a petition, we see these quite a lot. The fact that it was petitioned means there was some expectation of redress, there was some expectation of a response of a particular type, whether that's financial, monetary, emotional. How we read into that varies depending on how cynical you might want to be. And I think, yeah, I need to be a bit more cynical when I'm reading this. One thing that was pointed out to me as I've discussed this document elsewhere is, you know, the fact that this young girl who is enslaved, her experience of living in this world means that her geography and her geographic and physical environment is not restricted to the house necessarily. Her social environment is not just restricted to her immediate household. She's going off to do something, singing lessons, not for fun, presumably. You know, young people were recruited and employed to perform music and song at various religious services and so on. So we see these different types of experience. Now, this is just a quick overview I've given in this talk of some aspects of some snapshots of evidence that we've got for the experiences and agency of girls in one particular area of antiquity. And of course, I think the method that we have to use is to think about, firstly, material and visual culture, and the difference between a representation which children are meant to passively absorb and actually how they do absorb and play with it and reshape it, what agency they have in that. And I've written about that in a book edited by Lucy Grigg on popular culture in the Roman world, in which I talk about the idea of young people shaping their own experience and their own view and vision of the world around them, irrespective of what they're supposed to be absorbing in terms of culture. And we also have the method of, well, we've got these sort of snapshots of evidence referring to children. We very rarely have children's words or children's activities represented directly in the sources, and that makes it extremely difficult. I don't think it's any more difficult to do this for girls than it is for boys. I think we see different types of material depending on the social status across the Roman world of young people. So this paper, I hope, has raised quite a few questions, and I think in conjunction with some of the other papers on childhood through material culture and dolls, I think that there are some connections which we might want to draw out in the discussion throughout the conference. Thank you for listening.